morning. Namaste. It's really a pleasant experience to be here in the space of spiritual calm and the presence of very many noble souls I have known for a few years now. Friends, two apparently simple statements caught my attention last night when I lost my sleep. These were, few days back, a friend of mine in my Facebook discussion, status discussion, commented that, or perhaps asked, do you think this conference is going to be important for the common person? I left that question there and almost argued with him. I said that, well, this is a technical conference and you need to have certain expertise. Why do you think all conferences should be of benefit to common man? Of course, I think I could silence him for some reason, but I was not personally satisfied with my response. Yesterday, again, another friend of mine made a statement, oh, perhaps consciousness studies is no more interesting as it was 15 years back. And that again caught my attention and it worried me. I thought, why did he say that? And this morning, I had a little more clarity in my thought, and perhaps I thought there could be one reason why, if at all there is a suggestion that consciousness studies is not as interesting as it was 15 years back. This is because, perhaps 15 years back, our central problem of attention was the puzzle of conscious experience. And I don't have to say much about it. And what was the puzzle? The puzzle was that, how does discrete, quantitative, neural processes give rise to something which is unitary, subjective, and qualitative? Well, the central question asked in that puzzle was that, can we identify and locate the source of consciousness, or what makes conscious experience possible? Perhaps 15 years later, I think this was published in 1996, if my memory is right, by Chalmers. Today, are we excited by the same question? Certainly we are excited, but then what is the difference? The difference is that I think, according to me personally, you may contest that, is that perhaps today what we are interested or what we are intrigued by is not as much as what is the source of conscious experience, but what is the source of the conscious experiencer. The experiencer, the place of experiencer, according to me, in today's discussion, has taken a central place. And this brings to me the topic for the morning's discussion, which is the self. So today, perhaps we are more excited about the possibilities and the excitements that surrounds what is called a self, which we academically call as a concept. But we know that if something happens to that, we know how much perils are around it and how our easy lives otherwise in every day is affected. Friends, with these brief thoughts, let me say a few of the ideas which I would like to present this morning, but I'm already alerted that perhaps the time which I have is limited. In a recent article, if you read Journal of Consciousness Studies, famous writer and scholar Susan Blackmore, she presents two of her theses in a very fascinating and provoking manner. The first thesis is that many selves exist. The self by itself is fleeting and no continuous self exists. And any of the multitudinous selves or parts of them, according to her, could inhabit a machine, an information system. The second point she makes is that without sufficient recent analysis, that many selves in the future will be happier and contented and less depressed. Why? because more technologies will be used. I think there are some serious, significant issues that come up from the above discussion that should worry any researcher in consciousness studies. The existence of selves that are fleeting is not a subject that we can casually discuss, limiting them to the futuristic information technology systems. To consider the fleeting self as pieces of information, copied and stored in devices, is not even a viable postulate for experiments in robotics. The age of internet and robotics have gone beyond the simple information processing tasks and are entering much complex areas of social media and internet networks, as you know, which have a viral temperament and is ruled by the rules of human fragility. The self that we should talk about in the context of consciousness, in a sense, has no role to play in the emerging scenario of people-centered information technologies. By adding a concept of self, which is a team, to the artificial systems, we will not receive any new insights either about the information systems itself or about the grand idea of the self that is so central to consciousness. Why is that the self is not a team? Why I am me? Our existence, even in the moments of varying discrete events, is in the form of an agent and enjoyer of the action, not just for that moment, but for all moments that preceded and are yet to follow. Such continuity is definitely designed and customized by the culture we come from and the lifestyles we adopt so as to present our personal identities. Yet, there are universal and transcultural factors in the experiences that incur to us from the moments of events. The primary factor, friends, I think, that is not of social origin, and perhaps not even of biological origin, is the core self that provides an unnamed and unlocated space from where the human capacities for hoping and choice-making emerge, particularly when our life is at odds. The core self is not a fleeting self at all, and not even a thin subject with no ontic depth, as Strawson remarks. According to the material position of Strawson, a subject of experience is something that exists only if experience exists of which it is the subject. Since there are many temporary selves, the self as such has no ontic depth and is only a cognitively lauded feeling. This essentially means that every experience would have a subject of its own, and as experiences appear and disappear, according to Strawson and perhaps also Blackmore, the selves also appear and disappear. Friends, I think the central problem in such an argument that makes experience to be the causal agent for the self is that it cannot account for the very existence of experience in the first place. To have a self that experiences the experience at any given moment, it is necessary for the subject to have continued from previous experience. What is that which connects the subject of the previous experience to the subsequent experience? Memories can only give continuity to the content of experience, but not the subject itself, since there has to be a prior beholder of memories who can recall them at will. In which case, to whom does the first experience belong? Have you ever thought about it? And to whom does the subsequent experience accrue? Experience itself is influenced by the continuity of the experiencer as a continuing self who contributes to the content of each experience with his or her memories, choices, attitudes, and responses. Hence, the self is not a point of awareness that exists for a moment and thus available as many selves. Amazingly, the model of self that is taken by Strawson and many others like Metzinger and Blackmore and others is borrowed from the information systems which do not have any metaphysical import. The selves they talk about is a linguistic point of reference and a mode of awareness that ticks away for a particular event and which does not exist thereafter. Reminding us of the Humean and Buddhist self, they hold that other than the personal identity marked by culture and society, there is no continuous self. And this is something which worries me personally, perhaps according to my philosophical positions and arguments based on that. I would think that this is a dangerous and exceedingly superficial view. To deny the humans of the organic presence, and I underline that word, of a continuous self with a core which is not minimal, promiscuous, fleeting, and animalistic, but transcendental at any time, will be perhaps not just a casual omission, but a serious blunder to commit if one is interested in the character of the person and deeply philosophical values such as freedom and moral choices. I will not attribute the final values of human pursuits such as freedom and universal self to a fleeting self which has no say in the course of human life except for the discrete events. Nor can these values be attributed to social origin. Of course, our lives and styles as communities customize the expression of these values. But in absolute terms, these are values that can only originate from what I would like to call as the core self, which is a seat of the body sense and the self sense that rules our everyday life. Another interesting argument for the non-existence of a continuous self comes from some of the researchers in affective neuroscience who distinguish between pre-reflective and reflective states of self. And one of the recent positions, I wouldn't quote since of lack of time, describes the self differently as a common self and a translucent self which exists only in discrete activities and so on. This is from one of the recent publications of Fangsup, 2012. I can give you the exact reference later when there is time. Friends, let me reiterate. To discard the everyday sense of the self as fleeting and common sense feeling, to attribute rationality to thinking that is not influenced by frail emotions, to enthrone the cognitive capabilities of the self as the attributes of information and robotic systems, these trends have its origin not just in the recent past, but from the ancient times of the Greeks. For instance, the Stoics considered absence of emotions, apatheia, as a necessary condition for any virtue. The larger question that arises from the disregard for what is fragile and therefore uniquely human as not constituting the essential nature of the human self is how we understand the relation between the bland, without any spices, the bland non-being which is proposed, and the finer virtues such as freedom and the ultimate goal such as well-being. How is the being of the self connected with the incessant and most passionate quest for being well in life? Isn't it that, friends, that finally we all seek to be in that moment where we really feel well? Well-being is not just a goal, but it seems to be a continuously exciting goal. And from these agenda of human life, further questions arise such as what is desire, what is freedom, what is flourishing? The renewed contemporary interest in values of antiquity such as empathy and compassion and their biological foundations in mirror neurons and brain maps invite us to think about the phasing out stark divisions between me and the other, and to include more of the other in me. This would also bring in studies in cultural neuroscience, social emotions, place of emotions in decision-making, and most importantly, questions on the self-sense, its peripheries, and the ontic core. How much of the self-sense is embodied? Is the self-sense separable from the body schema and its proprioceptive capabilities? What is the role of ownership and agency in binding the self-sense to the body sense? What is the nature of the self-sense in people with acute impairments in movement and touch senses? Is the self-sense primarily a meaning-making mechanism that overrides bodily limits and disabilities? To study self is to study, in fact, I think, the self-sense, its dysfunctions, its transcendental nature, its causes, its psychosomatic challenges, feedback mechanisms between the self-sense and the body sense, and to search for new meanings of daily living. Friends, I would think, undoubtedly, and also as a response to this worry which my friend expressed the previous day, that perhaps consciousness studies is not as exciting, I would like to respond that it is more exciting than yesterday. Why? Because today, brain and self are considered the final frontiers of consciousness. And it is the boundaries of the brain and self that we have to continuously contest and expand. And most of the riddles which we today face in consciousness studies lies in this riddle. In day-to-day parlance, we use the word sense to mean a meaning which is conveyed or intended. I would like to say a little bit about the word sense because I use the expression self-sense and also the body sense. So what is a sense? For example, we might say, what you say makes sense to me. Another idea of sense is to be aware or to be clear in one's thinking. Or we might say, finally he came to his senses. The third possibility of sense is a vague or little awareness, such as I get a sense that something is not okay. Another set of meanings for sense is the faculty to perceive, the ability to move and assess posture, such as proprioceptive sense, and the fundamental and closest feeling of I amness. Are the self-sense and the body sense distinct senses? Because that's the first question which emerge when we talk about the self-sense and when we talk about embodiment. A dominant approach inspired by Aristotelian thinking is that the self-sense is the body sense. Who I am is closely tied to my embodied existence. I cannot sense myself without the accompanying body sense. Another view, perhaps which is more of idealist intent, is that the self-sense is not just a sense, but the essence. I amness is essential and is the core. Embodiment is only one aspect of self-sense. I would think such a view is not new and commenced from the time of the Upanishads in the East and Pythagoras in the West, later developed by Plato, Augustine, and Descartes. The extreme view is to attribute non-existence to the sense of self. The vociferous champion of this view, and very popular in recent days, is Thomas Metzinger, who equates the sense of self with yet another phenomenal experience, just as smell or taste. I know that my friend Harinarayanan perhaps would argue with me when I do a critique of Metzinger, because they have had many discussions. An immediately noticeable mistake that Metzinger makes is to club the self-sense in the category of percepts and sensory fields. If self-sense is another field, then how and why does this grand field persist and continues to hold and showcase all other fields is a valid question. Moreover, though it's empirically easier to conceptualize embodiment and the self-sense as one, experimentally it is otherwise. To understand our identity with body parts and body as a whole, to recognize the illusoriness and reality of that body or body parts which we own as ours, to relate to the representation of the body and its changing contours, require primarily the distinction between the body sense, the self-sense, and the inclusive core self, and therefore I would argue these three are not the same. What exactly is a body sense, the sense of the body which we are talking about? Body sense primarily is a combination of internal senses, such as, let me bring in the heart part first, pain, we usually dismiss that from our life. We talk about pleasure. But you recognize your body even if the pain is as minimal as a toothache or a headache. Pain helps us to relate to the body much closer. We also have internal senses such as balance, thirst, and hunger. We experience different kinds of pain, ranging, as I said, from a pinprick to much intense toothaches. We are able to walk without conscious thought about walking and without the constant fear of falling because of the balance that accompanies without our conscious thinking about it. Our living is also marked by the two inner senses, as I said, of thirst and hunger. This aside, we have the external senses for hearing, vision, taste, touch, and smell. We exterioceptively and interioceptively relate to the world through the panoply of senses and the body-mind complex. Now, what is the self-sense? And that is the hardest part for me, but I will try to delineate a little bit of what we could mean by self-sense. And I'm sure what I'm going to say is perhaps not too structured and clear, but it is more of a qualitative statements. But I don't know in any other way I could do this. Self-sense is an indivisible, continuous, and organic, again I underline the word organic, intuitive sense that accompanies all of human lives. And that doesn't mean that I would not disbelieve in the possibility of a minimal self-sense in other mammals and other animals. Self-sense in humans is responsible for self-recognition, which makes our life smooth, comfortable, and purpose-oriented. Imagine that morning, the morning when we no more recognize ourselves. It will be the most difficult day of our life. In effect, I am the thinker of my thoughts, experiencer of my emotions, beholder of my values, attitudes, and we use the word sense to mean a meaning which is conveyed or intended. I would like to say a little bit about the word sense because I use the expression self-sense and also the body sense. So what is a sense? For example, we might say, what you say makes sense to me. Another idea of sense is to be aware or to be clear in one's thinking. Or we might say, finally he came to his senses. The third possibility of sense is a vague or little awareness such as, I get a sense that something is not okay. Another set of meanings for sense is the faculty to perceive, the ability to move and assess posture, such as proprioceptive sense, and the fundamental and closest feeling of I am-ness. Are the self-sense and the body sense distinct senses? Because that's the first question which emerges when we talk about the self-sense and when we talk about embodiment. A dominant approach inspired by Aristotelian thinking is that the self-sense is the body sense. Who I am is closely tied to my embodied existence. I cannot sense myself without the accompanying body sense. Another view, perhaps which is more of idealist intent, is that the self-sense is not just a sense, but the essence. I amness is essential and is the core. Embodiment is only one aspect of self-sense. I would think such a view is not new and commenced from the time of the Upanishads in the East and Pythagoras in the West, later developed by Plato, Augustine, and Descartes. The extreme view is to attribute non-existence to the sense of self. The vociferous champion of this view, and very popular in recent days, is Thomas Metzinger, who equates the sense of self with yet another phenomenal experience, just as smell or taste. I know that my friend Harinarayanan perhaps would argue with me when I do a critique of Metzinger, because they have had many discussions. An immediately noticeable mistake that Metzinger makes is to club the self-sense in the category of percepts and sensory fields. If self-sense is another field, then how and why does this grand field persist and continues to hold and showcase all other fields is a valid question. Moreover, though it's empirically easier to conceptualize embodiment and the self-sense as one, experimentally it is otherwise. To understand our identity with body parts and body as a whole, to recognize the illusoriness and reality of that body or body parts which we own as ours, to relate to the representation of the body and its changing contours, require primarily the distinction between the body sense, the self-sense, and the inclusive core self, and therefore I would argue these three are not the same. What exactly is a body sense, the sense of the body which we are talking about? Body sense primarily is a combination of internal senses, such as, let me bring in the heart part first, pain. We usually dismiss that from our life. We talk about pleasure. But you recognize your body even if the pain is as minimal as a toothache or a headache. Pain helps us to relate to the body much closer. We also have internal senses such as balance, thirst, and hunger. We experience different kinds of pain, ranging, as I said, from a pinprick to much intense toothaches. We are able to walk without conscious thought about walking and without the constant fear of falling because of the balance that accompanies without our conscious thinking about it. Our living is also marked by the two inner senses, as I said, of thirst and hunger. This aside, we have the external senses for hearing, vision, taste, touch, and smell. We exterioceptively and interioceptively relate to the world through the panoply of senses and the body-mind complex. Now, what is the self-sense? And that is the hardest part for me, but I will try to delineate a little bit of what we could mean by self-sense. And I'm sure what I'm going to say is perhaps not too structured and clear, but it is more of a qualitative statements. But I don't know in any other way I could do this. Self-sense is an indivisible, continuous, and organic, again I underline the word organic, intuitive sense that accompanies all of human lives. And that doesn't mean that I would not disbelieve in the possibility of a minimal self-sense in other mammals and other animals. Self-sense in humans is responsible for self-recognition, which makes our life smooth, comfortable, and purpose-oriented. Imagine that morning, the morning when we no more recognize ourselves. It will be the most difficult day of our life. In effect, I am the thinker of my thoughts, experiencer of my emotions, beholder of my values, attitudes, and most importantly, owner of all these in an organic manner. Because of the self-sense, we become the agents of our bodily movements, possess intentions, make choices, and perform actions. In short, we possess, through the self-sense, an organic sensitivity. It is the organic nature of the self-sense that poses the fundamental problem in understanding the qualitative nature of consciousness. The phenomenology of our subjectivity and ways in which our body sense and self-sense are represented in our experience is a challenge for neuroscience and neuropsychiatry. And self is the source for the riddle of consciousness. Today's mainstream discussion in consciousness studies has brought in the role of self in an emphatic manner. either to dismiss it or affirm it. Both camps are equally excited, either to dismiss the self or to affirm it. A central question that runs through the major discussions today in neuropsychiatry, phenomenology, and philosophy is the place, nature, and origin of self. Self is mostly accepted as an organizing structure, embellishing the lives of an otherwise information processing system with colors, meanings, and motivations. Remember the movie The Bicentennial Man? If you have not seen it, a must-see movie. Such a tenor to embellish something which is otherwise bland also brings together disciplines as disparate as anthropology, cognitive science, philosophy, and biology. In the recent times, the debates on the self have more or less moved away from studying an abstract object to a living subject whose personhood is challenged and framed by neural and mental disposition. That is why there's a lot of excitement and interest in works of people like Jonathan Cole. Disorders that alter self-perceptions indicate how delicate and thin the neural and mental divide between what we call as normalcy and lunacy. The challenge is not one way, but two ways. We know that the subjective self, through his or her experiences, values, attitudes, and self-perceptions, can alter or influence neural changes to bring in qualitative progress in life. Is the self a subject for science? A subject in the sense, a subject for studying the subject? In both sense, the response would be no. Self is an object for science, as some of the previous speakers said. Science will never study self as the subject as subject per se. Since the subject is a non-entity for scientific discussion. But are we right in perceiving subjectivity and self as an object to be studied in test subjects alone? And I like this quote, and let me quote this for you. According to a recent researcher in a recent article writing on neuropsychopharmacology, he says, it's not only the subjectivity of test subjects, but also that of the neuroscientists themselves, which will be shown to play a crucial role in their experimental practice. Is the science's idea of objectivity truly objective? Traditionally, friends, the self has been included in the domain of religion and philosophy. The interest in science for the self in recent times is in the context of consciousness studies with specific reference to two phenomena exhibited by humans, such as altruism and empathy. Sociobiology has embraced altruism in the context of establishing all behaviors as oriented to selfishness for individual survival. Empathy has entered a relatively new field called neurophenomenology, which looks for the neural processes that underlie empathy. In our daily life, taking a phenomenological approach to the self, we look for the various dimensions and realms that indicate to us the presence of the self, in spite of the difficulties in talking about the self and establishing it with a sound theory. The individual unique theories of ourselves are designed by the values and beliefs we cherish. Can we forget that? Attitudes and perceptions we covertly possess, and memories that run through our thoughts and influencing our judgments. With a complex set of personal and interpersonal entities harbored in ourselves, in the course of a day, we feel secure at times, insecure at other times, and we constantly search in the process for our notion of what is well-being for each one of us. The day's activities we believe as the purpose of leading us to a being well state, or in biological terms, it's not that it's my favorite, a steady flow of dopamine in our bloodstream. Finally, does the discussion for self suggest an agenda for being well? Can the sciences talk about an agenda for being well? The central motivation for understanding the brain, the self, and through these two, consciousness, though many a time it's concealed by the agenda of supporting cognitive and information revolution, is actually to rediscover human well-being, especially for a person who is challenged by mental conflicts and other dissipative disorders. Along with other disciplines, psychology too is shifting its focus of study from pathological orientation, as Professor Rao said, to a positive orientation of life. Even what the study of pathological states finally see is the rediscovery of states of happiness and positive adaptation. Let me describe this a bit further. The primary distinction between pleasure and happiness, or if I may say, for the time being as well-being, is that the first borrows significant amount of content from sensations, and the latter is a deeper state that is situated in an undefined core self. While pleasure is dependent on objects, people, and situations, well-being is dependent on the inner disposition of the individual, his or her sense of autonomy, virtues, and a passion for common good. The multidisciplinary studies that have gone into defining the well-being agenda are also unanimous on that well-being or lasting happiness is not only the ultimate life goal, but also it is a primary means to pursue other goals and is responsible for life satisfaction. Subjective well-being is often interpreted to mean experiencing a high level of positive affect, a low level of negative affect, and a high degree of satisfaction with one's life. In almost all of well-being studies, the two life traits that clearly emerge are, one, meaning, and two, purpose. Can meaning be achieved through narratives, the stories of our life that we continuously write in our mind? The tradition of narratives termed as meaningful stories by Sachs in 1999 attempts to smoothen the uneven edges of mental life and find renewed meanings in life and in daily living. The narrative account of life stories gives an emotional closure to the conflict experienced by the self and a new beginning to renewed living. Whichever the source of origin is, my dear friends, we do have a need to knit together disparate edges, find new meanings, give up old beliefs, form new beliefs, and through all this, rest ourselves in its core space. And perhaps this is the reason why Dumbledore tells Harry Potter, in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, it's our choices that show what we truly are for, more than our capabilities. Thank you very much.